This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Cosmographia podcast with Randall Carlson. We are once again, and as always, joined by Bradley. What's up, Brad?
Hey, man,
How's
doing
it going
good
today? Doing good. Mike, how are you doing out
Howdy,
there?
guys.
Good. And Randall, of course, star of the show. What's up, my man? Oops. I said, what's up?
Be
careful now.
Oh, no. Giant mistake. Randall, how is it going, sir?
Well, I have no complaints. Here we are on March 21st. The world is in a weird place.
It is.
Yep.
Post equinox already.
Oh, the equinox is
Flying
come and
by.
gone.
Yep.
It's yesterday. Yeah, it was
So-
yesterday, I think.
Officially spring in the northern hemisphere.
It's 19th, actually. It was
Yeah.
extra early this year, irregularly early.
Extra early. Yes. So we are hoping that everything sort of normalizes within the next few weeks so we can get back out in the field and not have any extra roadblocks there on that front, because we don't really need that in our long-term game plan, which requires being able to move about, collecting data,
Right.
investigating sites. But I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will run its course.
I think so. I think it's going to run its course. Hopefully
And
sooner.
we can also hope that the environment, the post, crisis environment, is going to be conducive to an economic rebound
Yeah.
rather
Yeah.
than going into some prolonged depression. But I know that, my good friend Ian, we've talked about the restaurant that I've been building, which is now about 2 weeks from being ready to open, basically. And we don't know where we're going to be at in 2 weeks. Are we going to be able to open? But his other restaurant, yesterday morning, had to lay off 30 employees.
Oof.
So you got to wonder if some of the response isn't worse. A lot of questions raised about this whole thing, the way it's
Yep.
played out.
Same thing is happening with our business. Kyle and I are we work in the agriculture side of like an orchard for olives and grapes, and we have a tasting room in town that sells wine and olive oil and food and stuff, and they've had to shut the tasting room down. Now
Wow.
Kyle and I are still able to go to work out on the farm part.
Yeah.
But the tasting room, obviously, which is more like a restaurant or a bar, had to close down for safety. And since everyone else is doing it, you can't be the only one open. Seemingly quote unquote ignoring the problem. So it is an interesting thing happening right now. So
Yeah. But we're here to talk about interesting things that happened 12,800 and some years ago.
right, let's put it in perspective.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. We would have been worse off during that period of time by far than we are now. In fact, in some cases, the mortality rate may have been as much as 100%.
Oof.
Yeah. We're going to refer to a study that came out in 2011 by Jesse A.M. Ballenger, and his focus was on the American southwestern deserts and what happened at the end of the Younger Dryas as far as human population. And this was published in Quaternary International, like I said, in 2011. He asked this question: whether or not abrupt Younger Dryas climate change affected regional paleo environments and late Pleistocene hunter-gatherer populations is an important topic in the archaeology of the American Southwest. This paper reviews multiple age-resolved proxy evidence to gauge the magnitude and direction of the Younger Dryas chronozone, which is just a fancy term for the Younger Dryas, as a marker, particularly within the stratigraphic context. The magnitude and direction of the Younger Dryas chronozone environmental changes in different settings and systems. There are impressive records of vegetation, faunal, stable isotope, and geomorphological change coincident with the YDC, which is the Younger Dryas chronozone. These correlate with important adaptive changes in human hunting and land use, as revealed in the analysis of spatio-temporal distribution of late Pleistocene hunting technologies. Significant cultural changes that coincide with the YDC include the Clovis to Folsom transition, the demise of mammoth hunting, and the development of an emphasis on bison, increased regionalization, and this is the key part right here, the abandonment of the Northwest Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts by mobile big game hunters. So for centuries, there had been evidence of this being the Chihuahua Desert and the Sonoran Desert being actually much more humid with a lot more vegetation, and the existence of a very prevalent mobile hunting culture in that region. Younger Dryas begins, and what happens? The abandonment. So when they use the word abandonment, you would think, well, these people moved elsewhere, and that may have possibly been it. But the point is that they were there and then they were not there. Nobody's really necessarily knowing, though, if they moved, where did they move? Okay. Now, in that region, this was the San Pedro Valley of southeastern Arizona. I think I showed this last time, but it's quite impressive and worth looking at again. This is the black mat.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So there was cultural activity below, but not above. So this is an illustration from Ballenger. So then he goes on to say, the post-Clovis, and this is in the actually in the see, is this the abstract? No, I don't think it's the abstract. Doesn't matter where it actually shows up, but this is in his report. The post-Clovis archaeological record of the Southwest has been explained by the early development of a desert archaic adaptation. The most significant post-YDC change in material culture is the appearance of groundstone and pinto type and notch projectile points that occur between 9 and 8,000 carbon-14 years ago. So this is post Younger Dryas, and what he's talking about, the pinto type there is just the type of point that showed up several thousand years after the abandonment of these regions by the Clovis culture. He points out, he says, in the southeastern Arizona, a noticeable 1,400-year hiatus occurs in the archaeological record following Clovis and Pleistocene extinctions. Western stemmed projectile points are also rare in southern Arizona. In any case, there's presently no compelling evidence for hunters or gatherers in the northwestern Chihuahuan Desert or the Sonoran Desert interior during the YDC. So in other words, this particular area, which covers a vast area of the Southwest, when you include both those two deserts, did have cultural activity going on, which ceased right at the Younger Dryas boundary. And he actually refers to the extinction of the Clovis culture, which is, I think, is a legitimate way to describe it.
So these people occupied these areas that are now desert. Does that imply that they weren't as arid? Okay.
Yes, it does. It does. And I mean, they were a mobile hunting culture. So there was
a
lot of big game.
Right. And that's recent, geologically speaking, for a place to be not arid, and now it is. Right?
Yeah.
Usually,
yeah.
Okay,
well, we find that to be the case all over the world.
Okay.
The desertification has occurred in many places quite rapidly.
Wow.
So they conclude attention is drawn to chronological correlations that exist between the Younger Dryas chronozone as measured in the Greenland ice cores, regional paleoenvironmental changes, and major human adaptive changes during the Ballenger Younger Dryas transition, including the appearance and then the disappearance of Clovis technologies at approximately 12.8 thousand years before present. Second, a switch in large animal prey from mammoth and bison to primarily bison. So bison were one of the mega mammals that somehow managed to survive the mass extinction event. Remember, we've talked about it. I mean, there were, dozens of species that went extinct, but dozens of species survived. In North America, it was roughly, I think we're going to say about 70% of extant species at the terminal Pleistocene went extinct during that transition from Pleistocene to Holocene. And among the ones that survived were bison. Musk oxen was another one of the mega mammals. Moose. In the case of bison, though, the species did diminish in size from, the super bison, which may have been a precursor species. I'm not quite sure if the super bison and the post, the Holocene bison, which was considerably smaller, where it was actually descended. I presume it was. I don't know the exact genetic sequencing there. That's an interesting study that I would like to do, but there is so much. So Folsom regionalization, population growth from about just after 12,700 years to 11,700 years ago. So it would appear there was about a 200-year hiatus before the first Folsom artifacts started showing up. So the apparent abandonment of the northwestern Chihuahuan deserts and Sonoran deserts by hunter-gatherer populations after 12.8 thousand years before present, and the reappearance of people in the stratigraphic record of those deserts around 10,000 carbon-14 years, which was about 11,000 or 11.5 thousand years BP. So there's that interesting date again, which is now, the end of the Younger Dryas between 11.5 and 11.6. So real measurable cultural activity shows up in these areas, as it says here, they're giving the date at 11,500 years ago. So for the most part, these areas were, any cultural activity was absent. So then that raises the question, what became of the people that were there? And it really, did they move somewhere else, or were they essentially eliminated?
Yeah, once again, that it almost points to them moving somewhere else, because we have all of these, fossils of the various animals that were there, but there are no Clovis bones again. So it seems that if they had been destroyed with all of these animals, we should find their bones all over the place in these same layers.
One would think, although maybe the circumstances between, if you have a mass mortality event, is it going to impact humans the same way as mega mammals? I don't know. If carcasses are left just laying on the landscape, they are not going to last long. Right.
So the humans would have escaped any kind of flooding that may have deposited them in these.
And then succumbed
the
later to lack
died
of
from
food.
lack of food or fresh water or whatever.
Yes. Because we know that during some of the big plague events in history, the mortality was so widespread that people weren't getting buried. Their carcasses were just being left right there on the ground to decay naturally, generally presumed succumb to scavengers of various types, macro scale scavengers, as well as microbial scale scavengers.
Right.
So then, getting to the work of David Anderson and Albert Goodyear, they wrote a paper which came out in Quaternary International again, 2011. Multiple lines of evidence for possible human population decline / settlement reorganization during the early Younger Dryas. So the Paleoindian database of the Americas, which is abbreviated PIDBA, integrates database and geographic information system technology to provide location data for almost 30,000 Paleoindian projectile points, measurements, and other qualitative data, attribute data on more than 15,000 points, and provides photographs and or line drawings for nearly 10,000 Paleoindian points from across North America. And any independent researcher can access the Paleoindian database of the Americas. Put it in your search engine, go there, and you can begin to do research on the distribution of Paleoindian cultures through over a period of thousands of years. So when Anderson, Albert Goodyear, James Kennett, Allan West began to investigate and begin to statistically analyze the Paleoindian database, what they discovered was, and I quote, "These data clearly indicate a major decrease in the number of artifacts in many parts of North America during the early centuries of the Younger Dryas. This decrease is interpreted to represent a decline in human populations and or a major reorganization of settlement systems, something likely related to major changes in biota observed over this same general interval. In the southeastern U.S., now we just looked at the Ballenger study, which was the Southwest. Looking over at the southeastern U.S., this decline is particularly dramatic. The pattern of immediate post-Clovis decline in eastern North America is also similar in the central part of the continent, in an area defined by 21 states and provinces in the Great Basin, Rocky Mountains, and Great Plains. So this is a big chunk of the North American continents. All three data sets that they looked at, which included projectile points, quarries, and a statistical analysis of the radiocarbon dates that would be associated with human activity, called SPA data, basically showed that there was a major human population decrease, which they refer to as a bottleneck, or alternatively, population reorganization, which they would describe as being dramatic changes in settlement patterning. Right. So if, though, the Clovis culture survived and simply moved somewhere, then it should be apparent that, okay, their cultural activity ended here, but there's a continuation of it over here. Do we find that? That's the question. The SPA results provide evidence that similar declines or changes occurred across much of the remainder of the Northern Hemisphere. Of the Northern Hemisphere,
Wow.
it seems, with the exception of the Middle East. A wide range of evidence indicates that conditions during the initial few centuries of the Younger Dryas caused a significant drop in human populations or dramatic reorganizations of settlement in North America, and possibly also broadly throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And we will take a look here at
And I just want to say the quarries they're talking about are usually flint quarries, right? They're talking about where they're mining tool material.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Here is showing from the Paleoindian database, showing distribution of various points, artifacts over North America prior to the start of the Younger Dryas. Particularly look at how dense you see on the eastern woodlands and along the eastern coastal region. And undoubtedly, you'll note that this yellow line here is the shelf, which is very close to where the coastline would have been now at the late glacial maximum, which was the lowest. Now, by the time we get to the Younger Dryas, sea level has come up, significantly from its minus 400 feet low point, but it's already started to drown the coastlines that would have been, if there were people there, assuming there were people there, that would have been occupying the coastlines prior to the Balling and the Allerod going back into the late glacial maximum, which takes us back 14 to 15 to 16,000 years ago. And if there would have been a concentration of human settlement along the coastlines, of course, even by the time we get to the Younger Dryas and the first appearance of the Clovis, the coastline of the late glacial maximum is already underwater. So there's already been a forced migration landward away from the sea because of rising sea levels that were underway at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. But yeah, so here you see the number of points in the distribution. And then this area here is the Mississippi Valley, the Great Basin, the Colorado Plateau area. So then we'll go and we'll see 1,000 years later, the Folsom. Man. Now, look at the eastern sector of North America. Let's compare. Go back. Clovis, 1,000 years later.
Wow.
Look at over here along in California, along the western coast, in the Great Basin, in the Basin and Range province over here. Clovis points and the prevalence of Clovis points, and now will come 1,000 years later. Now, what we're seeing here in this area is Folsom. Now, an interesting subject for study and further clarification is going to be what is the precise linkage between Clovis and Folsom.
Right.
However, in many cases, there appears to be this hiatus. In some cases, 300, 400, 500 years. In other cases, like it said, up to 1,400 years before you begin to see the advent of this new cultural type, which was given a different name because it was just so distinctly different. So it's called the Folsom rather than the Clovis. Quite impressive. Also notice up here into Alberta, this is now during the period when presumably the ice-free corridor has begun to open up. And so Clovis people have begun to move in there, hunters and so on, and they've left a bunch of artifacts behind. And then 1,000 years later, they're gone. So that's a pretty impressive graphic there. Then we've got another graphic here, which is quarries. And the number of artifacts that were found, typically these quarries, they're going to be cutting the stone and then they're going to be, chipping the stone in order to create their points, their spear points, and whatever other artifacts are being made out of the stone of these particular quarries. So they looked at 3 different quarries, one at Topper, South Carolina, one in Tennessee, and one in Kentucky, all which showed considerably active. You find a number of, I forget what the exact area is of that they were looking at, but in whatever the unit area, whether it was a certain number of square meters, I think it was probably a certain number of square meters based on the total artifacts found. You'll see in Topper, you go from 400, in some maybe like 450. At the Tennessee one, it looks like about 800. Adams, Kentucky, you're getting up there close to 1,000 artifacts found. Then you get to the Younger Dryas right here, transition from green to red. So in other words, along with the abandonment of these cultural sites that you saw it in the previous diagram, you've also got the abandonment of these quarries. So in other words, they're showing activity for 200, 300, 400 years, considerable amount of activity, and then boom, no activity at all. So
They killed all the mammoths. Didn't need to make any more tools.
well, that
Right.
must have been it. So
Well, one of the things about Clovis artifacts is the, that's looked at in terms of their level of expertise is the actual materials that they went to great lengths to get in order to make them. So it is interesting. It's like that knowledge, even if the Clovis and Folsom people are the same people or connected, it's like they lost that knowledge of how to find or the right materials,
Yeah,
the
the
best
locations.
materials. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not only the locations, but they never, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Recaptured the.
Yeah. So it just seems to me like a loss of knowledge about where to go, where to get the material, why you would get that material, why it makes better artifacts.
And that correlates in the very steep drop off of activity in the quarries where they were getting the material. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
So in that same year, in the year 2011, there was another study published in Quaternary International. Lead authors were J. Christopher Ellis, H. Dillon H. Carr, and Thomas J. Loebel, I think. The article, The Younger Dryas and the Late Pleistocene Peoples of the Great Lakes Region. So they say the late Pleistocene archaeological record of the Great Lakes drainage area shows that there were several changes in that record in a time period corresponding to the Younger Dryas climatic reversal. Notable here are declines in some areas in the mobility of Paleoindian groups as measured by distance to the main lithic source employed. Right? That being the lithic source, presumably the quarry, right?
Right.
A second, declines in the overall frequency of sites and find pots, particularly in the Western Great Lakes, where some areas seem to have been largely abandoned. And an increasing association of occupation locales with glacial lake shores or extensive wetlands left by recently drained glacial lakes. Some of the changes, as in range mobility, most likely relate to the colonization of new areas rather than directly to the Younger Dryas. Specifically, the earliest groups were able to target rich but widely dispersed resource locales due to an absence of competing groups. Now, what did they just say right there?
They're able to go far and wide to get these materials because they're not fighting with each other, or they don't have to compete for those materials.
Yeah, because they're saying the colonization of new areas. So in other words, these areas that they're describing and studying around the Great Lakes have been abandoned. Now you have recolonization of those same areas. And as it says, the earliest groups that now come in afterwards were able to target rich but widely dispersed resource locales due to an absence of competing groups.
Right.
In other words, you've got a catastrophe. It wipes everybody out. There's nobody there for centuries. Now you have colonizers, people coming in and reoccupying that land. And there's no competing groups there. That's what they're saying, see?
Yeah.
So that's now a study that's, and we can begin to find these studies. More and more of these kinds of studies are showing this disruption in human settlement patterns.
And think about that must have been very, I don't know, I'm just picturing it, if you're in that later group that's coming in. Now, of course, the landscape has been massively changed by the cataclysms that have happened, but you're still going to see, if you very pay a lot of attention to the landscape, which these kinds of people did, you're going to see evidence of human occupation that's very old, that's been totally abandoned, and you're going to know, like, okay, we've been walking through this land, there's no one here. Obviously, something very, very powerful happened here recently, and look, people were here, but they're not here anymore.
But they're gone.
Yeah, must have been eerie.
I'm sure it was. Yeah, absolutely, it would have been. No question. So, yeah, and there's new studies coming out, or since the last, this one that I just quoted from was from 9 years ago. Here's a study that came out in 2013, so it's a little bit more recent, only 7 years ago, right? This was Felipe Crombie and 15 other authors, published in Quaternary International. Title of the article, Hunter-Gatherer Responses to the Changing Environment of the Moervaart Paleo Lake in Northwest Belgium during the late glacial and early Holocene. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so I'm sure if anybody out there speaks Belgian, could probably help me get the correct pronunciation. So this paper presents new geoarchaeological perspectives on the late glacial and early Holocene human occupation around a large paleo lake, Moervaart. I'll just say that. That's what I'll say. Moervaart Paleo Lake, approximately 25 square kilometers in area. Intensive field work using invasive and non-invasive survey techniques combined with modeling of the paleo topography and paleo groundwater and multi-proxy paleoecological analysis. Everybody knows now the word paleo just means old, from back, in archaic times. So the old topography, the old groundwater patterns, and the old ecology, right, that pre-existed the modern. So you've got the modeling of the paleotopography and paleo groundwater and multi-proxy paleoecological analysis have resulted in a detailed reconstruction of the landscape during the final Paleolithic and early Mesolithic occupation of the area. A major shift in the occupation from a cultural group called the Federmesser culture. And the Federmesser culture is an archaeological umbrella term, includes late Paleolithic and upper Mesolithic cultures of the northern European plain, which dates mostly to between, and get this date, 14,000 years to 12,800 years. This is the Federmesser culture, right? So notice that the dating of this particular cultural group almost precisely coincides with the Clovis.
With the Clovis.
Yeah. So that 12,800 years ago is referred to in terms of European archaeology as the late Magdalenian, right? Yeah. And then there was a separate culture that got a different name called the Ahrensburg culture sometime after 12,800 years ago. So in reference to this Federmesser culture, the authors here say that a major shift in the occupation from the Federmesser culture to the early Mesolithic was contemporaneous with a sudden and drastic change in the paleohydrology of the area, which they put at the end of the Allerod. So, and they're dating it roughly to 13,000 calibrated years before present, which coincided with a short but abrupt cooling event. The population decline, which followed this hydrological event, was then reinforced by the prevailing cold and harsh conditions of the Younger Dryas and probably lasted until the pre-boreal. So we're seeing the same kind of evidence now coming in from Europe, showing that there was a population crash very close to that Younger Dryas boundary. And then what appears to have been a hiatus throughout some portion of the Younger Dryas. Extensive geoarchaeological research along a large paleo lake from the late glacial in northwestern Belgium has provided valuable new paleo-environmental evidence permitting a better understanding of the occupation dynamics of the area during the final Paleolithic. The previously observed occupational contrast between the Federmesser culture of the Allerod and the early Mesolithic of the Boreal is clearly due to a major environmental change in the paleohydrology of the area. This change occurred as a sudden event. So the event was responsible for a drastic decline of human occupation in the area, which most likely persisted until the pre-boreal. So there we have it, a drastic decline in human occupation that pretty much existed through most of the, or all of the Younger Dryas. So, what do you make of this?
Well, that's showing us that most of the northern hemisphere was affected by this same event.
Well, that's
in terms of
what
human habitation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it's starting to look like. And there are more studies that are coming in that I haven't had a chance to really review yet. But Western Asia, for example, there appears to be a population crash in the Euphrates Valley. There appears to also have been studies coming out of Japan now, which suggest a population crash in Japan. So there is a lot of interesting stuff, and we're going to try to pull it all together as much as possible over the next few episodes, so that we can compile a lot of this information in one place and make it available to people.
Yeah, it's really interesting too and suggestive that it didn't affect the Middle East, or at least we don't see the same proxies, I'll call them, for that cultural change. And thinking back on the, series of Atlantis episodes, they perhaps sustained a culture that was able to tell these stories and maintain a sort of historical record through that disaster. And they learned of other cultures that declined or were completely destroyed. That's cool.
Yeah.
Is that the Dogon people that were in Japan?
No, the Dogon people were in sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not the Dogon. Yeah, what were they called? It doesn't matter. I know we've looked at this ancient Japanese culture, and they're very interesting. And I do remember there being a population crash around that time. They also supposedly had some of the earliest ceramics, pottery, earliest known.
Yeah.
The Dogu? I can't remember. Doesn't matter.
So,
are you thinking about the Ainu?
Not the Ainu. What were they called? I'll find it.
Strange looking spaceman statues.
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking of? I can picture that, but I don't recall their name. Looked like it had a space kind of helmet on.
Right. Yeah, they had some very strange statues.
Right. Randall, are you switching paper here? Do we want to take a little break?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, we're right at the time for a break. All right, we're gonna take a quick break. Be right back. All right, and we are back from the quick break we took. Randall, we ready to keep going here? What's the next?
Well, let's
take a step back.
I was going to say, let's expand our perspective even more.
Okay.
This is from a study that appeared, this goes way back to 1992, years before the impact hypothesis was even introduced. There's no effort here to make the case for catastrophe. It's just what the evidence seems to imply. Now, looking back in the context of what we know now, this appeared in the journal American Antiquity. Authors were A.M.T. Moore and G.C. Hillman. I presume they were archaeologists. The title of the article was The Pleistocene to Holocene Transition and Human Economy in Southwest Asia, the Impact of the Younger Dryas. And they go on to say that we present new evidence suggesting that the late glacial worldwide episode of cooling, known as the Younger Dryas, had a significant impact on climate, vegetation, and human economy in Southwest Asia. In the Levant, a new pollen core and plant remains from the early village of Abu Huraira, which has been in the news recently, indicate that forest gave way to steppe in response to the onset of drier climatic conditions contemporary with the Younger Dryas. Similar effects may be seen in pollen cores from elsewhere in Southwest Asia. Now, it should be pretty obvious that as plant species change with a changing climate or changing environment, the seeds and the spores and the pollens that they give off are going to change likewise. So this stuff is preserved in the stratigraphic record. So a scientist looking at these changing pollen types or changing spore or plant types can draw pretty accurate inferences about the changing of the environment. The alteration in climate and vegetation obliged the inhabitants of Abu Huraira to modify their plant gathering and led to significant disruptions in culture and settlement over a wide area. We argue that the stresses induced by these events were a contributing factor in the subsequent development of agriculture in Southwest Asia. So that was one of the main cultural adaptations as we see this shifting from hunter-gatherer based cultures to agricultural based culture. Also, a very distinct shift in plant usage, because at the cultural sites, they're processing plants, they're eating plants, right? Food plants or whatever plants that they're using for various purposes. There's major changes that were associated likewise there. So very soon after the start of the Younger Dryas, we see a more abrupt and unequivocal change, a complete cessation of the use of asphodel seed that was used for both food and medicine, and a dramatic decline in the use of wild cereals and at least some of the grass species. So in other words, they're seeing up until the Younger Dryas, they're seeing this evidence of this plant use that then at the onset of the Younger Dryas ceases. These people are not, there's no evidence that these people are, that there's people there using these plants. That's what I'm trying to say. The pollen sequences all suggest that the colder conditions of the Younger Dryas had a significant impact on vegetation throughout Southwest Asia and also in the extreme southeast of Europe. Everywhere, the Younger Dryas in Southwest Asia was accompanied by a decrease in moisture that caused a temporary reversion to partially stepic conditions more typical of the Planete glacial. In other words, it got a lot colder and it got a lot drier. So whatever people had been living there and had been adapted to the prevailing environment pre-Younger Dryas, suddenly the environment is very, very different. It should be also be noted that the 5 pollen cores cited earlier exhibit synchrony not only with the Younger Dryas episode, but also with 2 preceding changes in vegetation cover. So there was a series of shifts in climate and environment, and then the granddaddy was the shift from into the Younger Dryas. Kyle, would you look up the Natufian culture for us? Natufian, the Natufian culture.
Isn't it interesting also that a lot of the culture, this agriculture starts up after the end of the Younger Dryas.
Yes.
Whereas before that, the hunter-gatherer thing seemed to work. So it's almost like there was a response to a loss of both animal and plant material, to where they started trying to do husbandry and taking care of it themselves so that they could eat, because there just wasn't enough around anymore or something like that. I don't know. It's an interesting thing that it's after this cataclysm that the agriculture starts up.
Yeah, so Wikipedia says the Natufian culture is a late Epipaleolithic archaeological culture that existed from around 12,000 to 9,500 BC.
Okay, so they would be basically post Younger Dryas. You said, from what were the dates again?
12,000 to 9,500 BC in the Levant.
Oh, 12,000. Okay, so 14,000. Okay, because BC is where it gets confusing. When you're talking about historical, they'll use BC, and when you're talking about geological, they'll use BP. Most of the study goes on to say that most of the more substantial sites in the Natufian heartland were inhabited during the earlier stages of that culture. It is on those sites and several others that the Natufian culture has been found in its most developed form. They were substantial sites with huts and other structures, rich assemblages of bone and ground stone artifacts. and also exquisite natural carvings in bone and stone. As Gerard noted in her original survey of the culture, and Valla and Henry have since reaffirmed, most of those elements ceased to be made in the later Natufian. And occupation on sites in the heartland was disrupted. It now appears that this disturbance in the pattern of settlement in the later Natufian coincided with the environmental deterioration at the start of the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas climatic episode evidently had a significant impact on the environment of Southwest Asia. It interrupted the late glacial improvement in climate and vegetation and caused a return to the conditions of the pleniglacial. The consequences were severe for the Epi-Paleolithic II peoples of the Levant. Their modes of gathering were disrupted, and the resulting stresses led to widespread dislocation in patterns of settlement. It is surely no coincidence that the transition from Epipaleolithic to Neolithic, and from hunting and gathering to farming happened at about the same time, just as the Younger Dryas had run its course. So we see that once we begin to see cultural activity again, it has changed as dramatically as the environment has changed. And now we see that in the environment or the world of the post-Younger Dryas is when we begin to see this major shift into agricultural-based economies and cultures.
This is still your paper from 1992?
Yes.
Okay, and you're talking Southwest Asia?
Yes.
So this is like Iraq, Iran, what we consider
Yes.
Middle East?
Yes.
Okay, Afghanistan.
Yes.
Yeah, so also the Epi-Paleolithic is kind of synonymous with the Mesolithic, but it's for the Levant as opposed to, whereas Mesolithic is usually Europe, but it's basically the same timeline, 20,000 to 10,000 BP. There are,
That's weird that there's different names for it.
Well, and what I was getting to is that that's right after the Gulf War. So I'm wondering what happened to the studies, or what's changed with those sites, or if all that research stopped, or there's kind of been a battle zone over there since '91, right? So wonder what happened to some of those studies.
Good question. I don't know the answer to that.
We met a geologist nearby here that spent a lot of time working in those areas. So we're going to be talking to him.
So I would imagine, I would imagine it would be hard to not disrupt the studies that are going on or that have gone on since then. Yeah, so basically what we're seeing here is that, evidence is really emerging from widespread locations for either an abandonment, a disruption, or I would say even an extinction of these cultures that had lived and occupied these areas. So again, it supports the idea that not only in terms of environmental significance, the Younger Dryas had enormous cultural and historical significance.
Now, do the cultures in these other parts of the world that also declined during this period of time, do they have the same phenomenon of not being able to find any of the skeletons, or is that just here in the Americas?
I'm not apprised enough of the specifics. In this case, like I'm citing a study here where they're not looking for skeletons. They're looking for plant remains and pollen and spores. But then they cited the example of this village and the villages and the huts that they were building that were also stopped and were interrupted, but they made no mention of skeletons.
Of remains.
Of remains. The cultural remains, yes. The actual human remains, no. but there's a lot of interesting research here that needs to be done to address some of these questions. Absolutely. And to that end, we need to really get a handle on really what the hell happened.
Right.
You know, what did happen? I mean, obviously we're talking about an impact as a probability. And the evidence now for an impact is quite robust. But what was the nature of that impact? You know, what were the was it a single object? Was it multiple objects? Was it a stream of material? And something else that we're going to get into probably even in the next episode is when we start looking at the proxy evidence and the evidence for the compositional nature. That's when we get into some rather strange evidence. And the critics have rightly, in a way, referred to it, the whole scenario as a Frankenstein monster, almost as if it's, you know, the monster's pieced together out of all of these separate parts. And it does kind of have that character to it. So yeah,
suggesting that it's more complex than like a single simple event, right? That it's we're looking at a period of events, or like you said, a stream or a bombardment epoch or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the evidence for extensive biomass burning. Recent studies within the last couple of years really do support the idea that there was widespread conflagrations and firestorms associated with the onset of the Younger Dryas. So looking at going back to 2009, I don't think we've referred to the study by T.E. Bunch and P.H. Schultz, J.H. Whitkey, and others, a summary of impact markers and potential impact mechanisms for the Younger Dryas impact event at 12.9 thousand years ago. This was presented at the fall meeting of the American Geophysical Union in 2009. Talking about the finding of cubic and hexagonal nanodiamonds. This is one of the important proxy materials that have been found in association with the base of the black mat layer and the Younger Dryas, the Younger Dryas boundary. Some of the critics have suggested if there were aerial bursts, there may have not been a pressure great enough to create the cubic or the hexagonal nanodiamonds. Hexagonal, remember, what's called lonsdaleite. So they have been created in the laboratory directly from carbon vapor deposit, carbon vapor, right? And they have to create a high pressure plasma atmosphere that simulates the pressure conditions similar to those in an aerial burst, for example, Tunguska of 1908, which, as they point out here, is commonly accepted as the result of a near-surface aerial burst and has many similarities to the Younger Dryas event, which suggests that we should take and devote an episode to really looking closer at some of the things that are now known about the Tunguska event, because yes, absolutely, there are a lot of implications and lessons to be extracted from the Tunguska event from 1908 that can shed light on the Younger Dryas boundary events.
Right. There was a 100-year anniversary 2008 event where a bunch of people went out there to the site again and looked it over and did a bunch of studies. So a lot of interesting work came out of that, I remember.
Yeah. So in this paper, they're saying this. So this is now coming a little bit about 2 years after the first introduction of Firestone's paper in 2007. Until the announcements, now this is in the paper they read before the meeting. Until the announcements of a possible impact event at the beginning of the Younger Dryas around 12.9 thousand years ago, the Cretaceous Tertiary impact layer that resulted from the Chicxulub impact at approximately 65 million years ago was the only geological boundary layer known to contain coeval, or at the same time, peaks in various impact markers, including diamonds. Here we compare impact markers from the KT boundary, the YD or Younger Dryas boundary layer, and the 1908 Tunguska airburst layer. First order markers related to impact and biomass burning include magnetic spherules, carbon spherules, nanodiamonds, both cubic and hexagonal, or Lonsdaleite, iridium anomalies, charcoal, fullerenes, grape-like soot that is also referred to as aciniform soot because it's soot that has essentially fused together in clusters that are grape-like, and widespread extinctions, okay? Observations and analytical data for the Younger Dryas boundary are consistent with all of the KT boundary markers, right? Observations and analytic data for the Younger Dryas boundary, and this consists of magnetic spherules, carbon spherules, nanodiamonds, iridium anomalies, charcoal, fullerenes, aciniform soot, and widespread extinctions, right? So all of these observations and analytic data for the Younger Dryas boundary are consistent with the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary markers. Boom. 13,000 years ago, 65 million years ago, right? So the KT boundary was the biggie. This is the one now that virtually all of mainstream scientists accept, yes, there's a massive impact on the Earth. 65, it's actually been redated closer to 66 million years ago. But they acknowledge the reality of this giant impact that caused the extinction and then left in its wake this slew of these impact proxies that I just listed, right? Including the mass extinction episode. So what these guys are saying now, Ted Bunch and his gang are saying, is that they're consistent. What they're finding at the Younger Dryas boundary is consistent with what they've found at the KT boundary. While the last three markers, which are would be the widespread extinctions, the grape-like soot, and the fullerenes, are unknown or inconclusive for the Tunguska layer. But the others are associated with the Tunguska layer. In other words, there's no mass extinction associated with the Tunguska event. Selected markers for cratering events, for example, Chicxulub, are 1, a visible crater, 2, shocked minerals, 3, impact breccia, and 4, microtectites. None of these are known for the Younger Dryas event, but none of them are known for the Tunguska event either. Although we will return to the question of craters with regards to the Tunguska event, because it may not be, there actually may be some geomorphic events, even though you have an aerial burst rather than an actual impact that excavates a crater form in the landscape. So, visible crater, shocked minerals, this is typically going to be minerals with quartz in it, because the shock waves passing through the molecules and the crystalline structure, particularly quartz, leaves a very distinctive pattern in the mineral that are called PDFs, planar deformation features. And those planar deformation features are very convincingly diagnostic that high pressure shock waves pass through the rock, right? Shock quartz has not been found in association with the Younger Dryas boundary hypothetical impact. Microtectites. Now, this is one that's inconclusive. But again, we're going back to 11 years ago. There's been some interesting research subsequent to that we're going to look at. However, no impact breccia with Tunguska, yet it was an aerial burst. So this would kind of lead us to believe that we're looking at aerial bursts, or the other possibility, and they're not mutually exclusive, is direct impacts, but direct impacts into a pre-existing ice sheet, which is going to create a completely different geomorphological response than an impact into a typical terrestrial target that would excavate a crater-like form. The discussion here is limited to possible origins of the impact markers and not with the impact consequences such as climate change or mass extinctions. Several origins may account for impact materials in the YD boundary. One, an extraordinary accretion of micrometeorites, which was one of the critics proposed was the explanation. However, this is inconsistent with the YD boundary carbon spheral compositions, including the large concentrations of nanodiamonds found embedded inside carbon spherules. Two, oblique impacts into the Laurentide ice sheet. This model is consistent with the lack of a visible crater and apparent lack of cratering markers, as described above, and yet also provides for shock production of many cubic nanodiamonds and lonsdaleite found in the YD boundary. Impact 3 would be impact-induced aerial burst. Okay, so we've got those as possibilities. Oblique impacts right into the ice sheet, or impact-induced aerial bursts, which would be referring to Tunguska-type events. So one of the regular criticisms launched towards the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is the lack of a crater. Well, now we know that a crater has been found under the Greenland ice sheet. It's been named Hiawatha Crater. A potential second crater has been found. The dating suggests the possibility that it could be coeval with the Younger Dryas boundary, but it's not definitive enough at this point to say, yes, this is a Younger Dryas impact here. They finally go on to say that the lack of high shock pressures in aerial detonation does not necessarily preclude the formation of cubic and hexagonal diamonds. The Tunguska event, this is reiterating, is commonly accepted as a result of a near-surface aerial burst and has many similarities to the Younger Dryas event. Comet grazing of the atmosphere involving nearly tangential entry of a comet into the Earth's atmosphere with partial detonation and melting, followed by escape of the unexploded nucleus into space. Brad, you might pull up the background that you had last week, which was something I put together probably close to 20 years ago as what I was conceptualizing as a plausible scenario.
Oh, yeah.
I can do that.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind. I'll read it again. Comet grazing of the atmosphere involving nearly tangential entry of a comet into the Earth's atmosphere with partial detonation and melting, followed by escape of the unexploded nucleus into space. This has the net effect of an atmosphere penetrating aerial burst, followed by global fallout of detonation products. So,
how big would something like that have to be to essentially set fire to the world?
There we go.
There it is.
There it is. Okay, I put this graphic together. I modified a pre-existing painting, but it was showing a clear mist between the comet and the Earth. And I did a little photoshopping to show the disintegrating comet in a tangential grazing type impact that would have resulted in the nucleus escaping into space, the unexploded nucleus, but the Earth getting bombarded by the spallation of the disintegrating comet.
Right.
And that's what he says right here. A grazing of the atmosphere involving nearly tangential entry of a comet into the Earth's atmosphere with partial detonation and melting, followed by escape of the unexploded nucleus into space. So this was proposed in 2009, and I think I did this graphic probably in the early 2000s.
Right.
I might actually be able to go back to the original program I did it in and find the date of creation, but it was definitely before this paper came out. And so we have this being put forward as a plausible scenario.
Right. And to answer Mike's question, it's I don't know how big the nucleus would have to be, but it's really all these explosions that are happening in the atmosphere that start setting everything on fire.
Well,
Right, but for something to not be drawn in to by Earth's gravity, it would have had to been massive enough to have its own gravity and essentially slide right by.
Well, you got to remember it's moving really, really fast.
Yeah, if it's got the right inertia, it
And
slips past.
right, the momentum is going to just keep it going. If it's not a direct impact, it's moving too fast. But what would happen here is that the debris field, as the thing disintegrate, is widening exponentially from the nucleus. Now we're going to get into discussion some of the models that have been put forward, particularly looking at the work of Bill Napier and Victor Klube and those guys, Duncan Steele, William Asher, and others who've been looking at potential comet scenarios. And the hypothesized nucleus size could be 60 miles in diameter or greater.
Poof. And if the nucleus itself grazes the atmosphere as well, that's going to cause, even if it doesn't impact anything solid, it's going to cause all kinds of problems and put an enormous amount of heat energy into the atmosphere as it burns through. Yeah.
Actually, that map that you had up, Brad, it has this gap in, through the Middle East. So and on either side of the map would be the Pacific Ocean. So it's like the comet would come by kind of passing over the Pacific Ocean, and the land masses on either side of the Pacific got affected, but the Middle East was left. You see what I'm saying?
So this, go ahead
again.
and
Go.
I'll do a share screen of the graphic that Brad had up.
Right.
Yeah. So if you were looking at that on a globe, then these two areas would actually be, you could consider them connected through the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
Right. However, the Australasian tektite field is from a completely separate event.
Okay.
And what this graphic is doing is showing that the Australasian tektite field has been known for decades. The source crater or source impact has been a mystery. I think there's some new research that's just come out on there that they possibly have located an impact epicenter that's responsible for this. But it was considered up to this point
in the last couple months.
Yeah. The Australasian tektite field was considered to be the largest, most widespread tektite field on Earth. So what they're doing here in this graphic is they're showing, by comparison, the Younger Dryas boundary field. And so Abu Huraira that we were just talking about is this red dot here. One of the Belgium studies in that area that I was referring to, and other studies up here in northwestern Europe. And then, of course, multiple studies in North America, and then even a study down in Venezuela, which is, I think, William Mahaney and others that we will talk about those interesting studies. This one in the red dot here in Mexico is the studies we talked about by
Chihuahuan.
Alcantara.
Quizio,
Yes,
Quizio.
Lake Quizio, exactly. However, there are new studies that actually extend the boundaries of the Younger Dryas. This should actually be YDB. So this is a very confusing. The Younger Dryas boundary field. So there are new studies that actually
Younger boundary Dryas field.
yes, that too. So yeah, that have extended the considerably, which we will address. So
If I had a prize, there was one person that pointed that out. I did recognize that when I had it up previous episode, and one person did pick it out. So if we end up with a T-shirt, maybe they'll end up with one. They found it. Yeah.
So what are we going to get into next podcast, Randall? What's plans for the next one?
Well, we're going to continue on. I figured a couple more episodes just to round out, because there's still some really juicy stuff to talk about as far as the Younger Dryas and where it's come. So, I mean, some of the newer stuff we need to address. We've skipped over a few things. I would really like to look at the Venezuelan studies.
All right.
I think that would be worthwhile. Also, there's some studies in central Mexico, in the Tochula mammoth site, which is a well-known paleontological site where mammoth remains had been found, and now a few years ago they discovered a micrometeorite layer, and so the association between that micrometeorite layer and the mammoths entombed within this material looks very interesting. So that would be worth getting into some more. And then the evidence for global wildfires. We definitely need to look at that. Yeah.
Sounds great.
It's good stuff. Then moving on, I would like to.
Sorry.
Oh, I would just say I'd like to devote an episode, at least one episode, to a more in-depth study of the Tunguska evidence, because that is really important cosmic lesson for modern peoples, and and what we're still learning about it, because it gives us so much additional insight into other events such as the Younger Dryas.
Sounds great.
Let me since we pulled this image back up, can I make a wild speculation?
Please do. I don't know. Should we vote or just?
Well, what we just said about the body passing really close by is what the electric universe people keep asking for to create these electrical discharges, right?
Yeah,
sure.
So
that's true.
So that's one of the bodies that could come by to do this. So we've Randall and I have found multiple places across Canada that we think look like obvious impact sites due to their drainage patterns. So I'm gonna speculate that Hiawatha is where the magnetic pole was, and that's where an electric discharge hit to create that crater. And there are bolide impact disintegrating comet craters across the ice sheet, but Hiawatha is from the electrical discharge. Because if you remember that graphic I showed from the very first Cosmography 101 video, it is right in the middle of the mass of the ice, the geographical center, pretty much.
Oh, of the old ice sheet.
Yeah.
Is that
so,
okay?
So
I'll throw my wild speculation out since we got this graphic up here.
All right.
So are you buying into the electric universe theory now?
Well, do you buy into Democratic or Republican because of one thing?
Whoa.
Whoa. Let's not go there, Bradley.
No,
but yeah, I think I agree that there would be some elements of it are very plausible. There are others that are kind of like harder to accept.
Yeah, but see, what's the evidence for the fact that it's a massive lightning strike? How do you?
I don't know.
We're not going to start that.
I don't know. I think you already started it, Brad.
But Randall, see,
You
Randall
brought
said
it up.
Randall said the magic
To
word,
be
which is
continued.
plasma. When they were trying to recreate these things in the lab, they were using
Plasma.
plasma, and so it's, you know.
Well,
I
look,
mean,
that's one reason, like, I want to get into Tunguska because there were electrical discharges during that entry into the atmosphere, and it only makes sense. You know, the lightning was a phenomena that was associated with it. However, that
yeah.
doesn't mean that the evidence suggests that Tunguska was a fragment of Comet Encke, that it was a piece
Mhm.
of solid mass that entered into the atmosphere, right? And so that's not really going to be, I don't think, the same as the electric universe model, which doesn't really, I mean, most of the EU comments that have come on have really tried to dispense with comets and
Impacts at
asteroids
all.
altogether.
Right.
Yeah.
They have.
And impact cratering is not from impacts, but from lightning bolts. See, now that, because I mean, we've literally witnessed impact events. We can find pieces of meteorites associated with impact craters,
Right.
right? And the evidence all ties together. You find a piece of a meteorite, you geochemically analyze it, you look at a typical, whether it's a stony asteroid or an iron asteroid or a carbonaceous chondritic, you look at the emission spectrum, it's totally consistent with the geochemical analysis. I mean, there's just too much there to say, oh, there were no impacts.
Right.
See? So that's,
But I do think that with those kinds of large events, you will end up with a lot of lightning strikes because it causes crazy storms, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And
I would just say in general, there's a lot of holes in the standard model.
Yep.
And there's nothing wrong with looking for other explanations because
Not at
we
all.
don't understand all the details about how the universe works. So there are some very interesting and plausible suggestions by the electric universe hypothesis. There are other things that I think that I'm just like, no, I don't think that's what's going on. But it could be, again, a combination of variations of things, right?
Yeah.
From both models, and probably more that we haven't thought of.
we know that there's lightning storms associated with volcanic eruptions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and I did what I said we weren't going to do. So, we were trying to wrap up and then we get into another long extended conversation.
That's great.
So I was trying to just put it under the radar, throw it out there, and then we could still shut down.
You can't do that, Brad. You can't slide one in at the last minute and expect it to go unnoticed.
The handler has spoken.
Right. Mike the handler is not going to let that one slide.
I'm the derailer.
All right, guys. This has been a great show. We really do need to wrap it up, though.
I'm ready.
So everybody can get a hold of us, find the website, or support Randall. All the links are in the show notes, whether you're listening to it on regular RSS feed or you're looking at the YouTube video. All the links for everything, support and websites and everything, and email, all in the show notes. And we want to thank everybody who is supporting the show a lot. Thank you guys so much. Your support means a lot, and you are helping us produce this new and very professional, very awesome, and soon-to-come website that we are getting.
And we're just waiting for things to break loose and get back to some semblance of normalcy so that we can pull the trigger and launch this enterprise to the level that it warrants.
Absolutely. And one other thing, if you are still interested in possibly going on a Scablands trip, there's also a link to check that out in the show notes. Go take a look. Don't worry if it says it's sold out. Still let us know if you want to go. I don't think it says it's sold out right now, but just let everybody who wants to go, let us know you want to go so that we can figure out how many spots we need, okay? So, yeah, get a hold of us if you want to go and let us know what's happening. All the links are down in the show notes. All right, guys.
Yep.
See you next week. Excellent show.
Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Hasta la bye-bye.
Yeah.